Welcome everybody to the Singularity University London chapter webinar, where we are going to do a deep dive, shallow dive investigation into adaptability and adaptability quotient. And specifically, we're going to ask those questions about what are the skills that are in the workplace today? How can you use those skills to create adaptable workforces, and particularly in this time of COVID where we're seeing such upheaval, how can you migrate skills to adapt to the changes that are not only happening now, but will be happening in multiple iterations going forward? Because if there's one thing that's for sure, is that there's always going to be change. Change is a constant. So thank you for joining us. Please use the chat to raise any questions as we go through the webinar. Tell us where you're from just to get warmed up. And let me introduce some of the panelists today. We've got an amazing set of speakers, and I hope you can see the share screen. I'll go from left to right on the screen. We have Ross Thornley, who is the CEO and founder of AQai. He is also one of the graduates of Singularity University EP program. How long ago was that, Ross?
That was back in 2017.
2017.
That was with the A360 group and Peter himself. We went.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this probably came on the back of that, I'm guessing.
It certainly was inspired by, yeah, for sure.
Wonderful. So welcome and thanks for coming on to the show and being open to share everything that you've been doing over the last couple of years. We also have Dr. Nicolas Deuschel. Hello, Nicolas.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hiya. And he's a professor of organizational behavior and HR from the University Carlos III of Madrid. Is that right?
Yes. The Carlos is in Spain very important.
But you've also held senior positions in Fortune 500 companies. So you are both a practitioner, but also know the theory very well, and has helped create the model behind AQai. So welcome and thank you for sharing your insights as we go into the session. And then finally, we have Jason Slater, who is the Chief of Financial Management and Technical Corporation of UNIDO, a United Nations agency that does amazing work in this space. And this is really showing where the rubber meets the road, the theory and the practice merge. And we're going to hear from Jason about how he's been using AQai. So fantastic panel, fantastic setting. I hope that some of you have been able to use the tests. If not, then there is a super code that gives you free access. I took it myself a couple of days ago, had a lot of fun with the chatbot asking me a series of questions and then giving me an adaptability score at the end. So feel free to try that. And if you have tried it, you've got the experts here on the call that have created it. So you can bounce some questions back at them. So without further ado, I think we're going to dive right in and jump into, first of all, Ross, who's going to give us a little bit of a story about how it started, what's behind the science, and go. Take it away, Ross.
Perfect. Thanks, Mitesh. So to start with, what we're going to go through in the next sort of 40 minutes or so is what is adaptability in AQ? And there's a difference between the word adaptability and adaptability quotient as a measurement. Why this really matters. I think a lot of the SU alumni and context are fully plugged into an exponential world and how our adaptability in AQ is going to be a key measure for future success. But for others, it might be a new term. And then we're going to do a quick poll for you, get some interaction and involvement. As Mitesh said, client impact story with UNIDO that we've been working with for a while, and then some science behind the model and the platform demo. So let's dive in. To start with, we think of adaptability in this context of a disposition and skill that covers psychological health, social, academic, and workplace environment. So this isn't just a context of work. this is in our whole lives, how we adapt. And, you know, this is an important phase, as you mentioned, Mitesh, in terms of COVID. This has been an accelerant to our need to adapt in certain areas. But when we then approached and dived in, and Nicolas and I worked very closely on building the AQ model, and our model covers not only the individual's ability and their characteristics, which is kind of a more familiar psychological and personality profiling that you might be already have done in your organizations, but then also situational factors, so environmental factors that either inhibit or accelerate one's ability to adapt in change of circumstances. Why this is really important, many of you will have been aware of this underlying exponential technologies going much faster than humanity can adapt. We've now had an accelerant, you know, a surprise party to the fact that we really need to adapt or die. And this rate of change is then shifting the future of work, specifically in the volume of people needing to reskill, and reskill not only because of technology, but also the types of jobs and types of roles that don't exist yet, how we might be able to plan and thrive in that kind of environment. The reality, if we don't get it right, what happens? You know, if we're not adapting, the risks are huge. You know, we will look at not only the emotional stress, anxiety, and friction caused from not being in flow and alignment, but also then job risk, team risk, and organizational risk, and at worst, bankruptcies and redundancies. So this really is serious. And if we're not focusing on it now, it's going to be too late. Where can we do it in our businesses? And you'll be running lots of different initiatives, some things that have happened because you've been working on it for a while. Maybe digital transformation has been both a project and ambition that now has become a real need to virtualize so many parts of your operation. It can be driving innovation from identifying who is going to be more adaptable to new technologies and experimentation, to even things like changing careers and reskilling and the new procedures and changes required when we return to work safely. I know, speaking to Jason yesterday in Vienna, that has done very well with COVID. The campus is maybe 6,000 employees and 5,000 are back in the environment. But how do people adapt to those new processes, those new procedures, and how can you support it as organizations and leaders? So if you, Mitesh, could just get a temperature of the audience that we've got. I think we've nearly got 40 people here. Just how do you feel prepared your people, teams, and workforces are for the next 12 months? Not very, we'll get through it, highly or extremely. If you can just take a moment to get a sense there for us of the next 12 months. You know what's ahead? The team are ready, you're ready, the workforce, and submit your thoughts.
That's really good. 83% so far voted. Let me end the poll as we've got over 90%.
Great. Nice and responsive. That's what we like. So can you share those results for us, Mitesh? Just so we can get an idea. Okay.
There we go.
So a big spike there, 60% plus in terms of we'll get through it. I think many people are feeling that, you know, especially true when things are uncertain, that it's the sense of, okay, we'll get through it or not very. I would love to know the 12% that are extremely prepared and ready. Perhaps we can have a follow-up webinar, invite them on the panel and see what they've been doing and what they've been up to. My hunch is they're going to be highly adaptable organizations and cultures that are there. So in terms of now, let's, as you mentioned, Mitesh, where the rubber hits the road, let's hear from Jason in terms of what the context was, what actions you took, and what have been the results of looking at your adaptability as an organization. So I'll hand over to you now, Jason.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, Ross, and thanks, Mitesh. It's an absolute honor to be with you all this afternoon. So yeah, I'm working in a specialized agency for the United Nations. We focus on industrial development, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the UN at large, and then home in on how we actually went through this exercise, AQai as one of the early beta testers with Ross and his team. So what was the trigger point for this? What was the challenge, and why did we undertake this? And I think some of the issues I'm going to refer to are not unique to the UN, especially those of you working in the area of finance. So there's a very clear trend when we're looking at the future of finance. Yeah. So we see us coming from a very traditional way, accountants, the way we go about our work, etc., certain processes, using these very large ERP systems that we invested over 10 years, over $1 billion. So huge investment. But how is this actually allowing us to transform, especially given all of the UN reform that's going on? I think you all hear in the newspaper about how we need to become more efficient, how we need to become more streamlined and ensure that certainly the financing goes to the people that really need this so that nobody is left behind. So with that, we see that there's certain disruptions coming into our area of work. So around digitalization, how are we going to harness the power of artificial intelligence, machine learning? How could blockchain support us in terms of our reporting and tracing money? Not to mention the organizational transformation that's going to be coming at us. So what will our workforce look like? What will our roles be? You know, we are traditionally a team of accountants. We need to move towards becoming data scientists. We need to visualize more. Do we even need to produce a set of accounts? And last but not least, I would say, which is critical, is strategic finance. We have a set of global goals which have been defined, agreed with the governments. We have a target of 2030. We currently have a $13 trillion financing gap. So our focus needs to change. How can we make sure that we mobilize private finance and impact investment, etc.? So this is the challenge that we have been confronted with within the UN. There are 50 UN agencies. And of course, I'm now going to home in specifically on how we, from that challenge that's for the entire UN, we took certain actions that could help us as a UN agency focusing on industrial development. So the next slide, please, Ross. So with all that in mind, we asked ourselves, well, we have to start to look at innovation and ask how can we adapt? So adapt in terms of the technology, but also adapt in terms of the skills and the roles that we need as a finance department. So luckily, and for me, is that I've worked with Ross and his team. I won't go into that on a number of initiatives before. And they asked us whether we would like to participate in an AQai beta test. I don't think we quite anticipated how much we would get out of this when we started the exercise, I think last summer. So to give some context, we're talking about a UNIDO finance team of around 40 people, ranging from people who've been working or in their 20s, 1-2 years, to people like myself, who's been there for 20 years, who's, likes to consider myself in my mid-40s, etc. So that was the catchment. And we said, well, let's go ahead and do this assessment and let's see whether we are adaptable, whether we can look at what is coming to us in terms of disruption and are we prepared to change, etc. So we went through this exercise we did it as individuals, and then we looked at ourselves as a team. I just give you a personal quote here from one of the team members who participated. What a great survey and personalized chat box. It makes you think deeper into yourself. So it goes beyond how you are in the workplace, but actually asking you certain questions about how do you see your role in terms of technology at large outside of the workplace. So we undertook that exercise. The results, I will not go into too much detail because I think maybe Nicolas will touch on how this is assessed later on. But it told us a lot of things, that we have a team of people that are ready to embrace change and innovation, but they feel constrained by the environment that they're working in, which I think is probably what one would stereotype people working in the UN. We work in our individual offices, etc. So that was the first thing that came out of this that we decided to do and undertake it. The results were so enlightening that we actually had planned what we call a Vienna-based organization workshop. There are 5 UN agencies in Vienna. As Ross mentioned, that's around 6,000 people, and each one has their own finance teams. And we decided as a result of the AQai beta, let's run an interactive workshop only on this topic. It is so critical for us. It's something that we have to address, not on our own, but coming together. So we ran an interactive workshop focusing on finance, innovation, adaptability, with a caveat: creating solutions with resource constraints. So do more with less, if you like. This was something that the AQai team helped us and guided us through throughout the couple of days. And I will come on the next slide to how some very specific outcomes from this workshop and from the actual assessment that we went through. So what were the outcomes from all of this exercise? It led us into looking at, well, in terms of technology, what do we need to learn? What do we need to nurture? So what would we need to learn? What do we need to let go? What do we need to unlearn? So in addition to that, what are the skills that are needed for us to go forward, and those that we need to leave behind? So you see here that in terms of nurturing, was looking into the future, robotics, automation, machine learning, harnessing artificial intelligence. How can we move towards much more virtual-based training? When it comes to managing the finances of our member states and governments and partners, how can we harness blockchain and digitalization of money? But interestingly, quite some big things to let go. Paper-based, I guess, is fairly obvious, but ERP software, as I mentioned before, a 1 billion investment in 10 years. And the people who are using this feel that this is holding them back. They need to unlearn this, and not to mention the way that we track and ticket things within the system. So, but then interestingly, you move on then to the skills. What did we identify very clearly, as this entire webinar is focusing on, is how can we adapt and put ourselves in a position to change? How can we become much more flexible? By flexible, it's not just in terms of individuals, but the way that we source, in-source, outsource, the types of people that we need to nurture. You know, for example, myself who's running the, you know, my own particular team, do I need an accountant going forward? Do I need to look at people who can analyze the data? Do I need to look at people who can code? So we need skills that are much more flexible and provide much more full multifunctional skills that go with it. Things to let go, unlearn, resistance to change. That's a cultural issue. It's one that certainly we've been challenged with for a number of years within the United Nations. I'm sure other organizations go through similar. How can we break down some of the bureaucracy and the narrow mindset? So from all of those outcomes, we basically just bundled it into two things. What is an obstacle? What prevents us? And what is a strategy that allows us to go forward? And so these are very specifically that came out of our assessment, but then also the interactive workshop. So here you have, in a nutshell, what are the 5 organizations feel that they need to move forward with. And what would I say are the key takeaways from this? So absolutely, embrace adaptability. Create a space to learn and unlearn. Now, some of you may have this in your companies, your organizations. The UN office-based. We're working now with a university to create an innovation center as a consequence of this. We need that space. It's important that you know what is your baseline. How do I compare? We were a bit nervous, but thanks to this exercise and the results, we could really see how we were in terms of the challenges ahead, in being able to change and adapt, etc. Now, for me, the next point, this is very much also personal, is it's not about looking at adaptability in the sense of incremental change, but really how you can transform, really how can you set your moonshot. I have a dream when it comes to my reporting. I want every single government member state who gives us a sense to sit on blockchain so that we can trace it, we can ensure that we do it at minimal cost, we have full transparency, and we measure the results. And that's why moving on to the next, you have to ensure that what you're doing with your team, allow them to fail, let them fail fast, but at the end of the day, they will succeed, and you have to support them during that process. That's quite a different mindset than let's get things done, get it done quickly, and it must be right. That's a completely different mindset than what we've been used to in the past. Have we produced results? Because I think you need to demonstrate, I certainly need to do when it comes to my senior and executive management, and yes, we have. We've now harnessed that robotic process automation. We're rolling out bots in treasury and payments. We're piloting blockchain with the support of the government of Germany. who've developed a tool that we are now actually one of the early adopters. And from all of that, I guess from us and Ross just mentioned, we've just come out of a lockdown here in Vienna in Austria. It was very well managed. There are 6,000 people in the UN here. 5,000 of us are now back in the office. But during this, we had to adapt extremely quickly. We moved quickly to online communications, fairly straightforward, Zoom, WhatsApp, Slack. But interestingly, we used this to harness an innovation with our member states and governments that we've digitalized the way we present financial information to them. And now that will become the norm. It is something that we've managed to embrace and we will not be stepping away from. And last but not least, a very specific thing that we knew we had to adapt was how can we ensure that we manage and monitor our risks when it comes to our operations? So very quickly developing a risk management dashboard which can monitor our productivity, which I will openly say is around 10% down at the moment. So these would really be some of the key learnings and recommendations that I personally would put forward. Adaptability, make sure that things are actionable and you produce some of your results, but at the same time, don't be afraid to fail. And I thank certainly Ross and his team. It was a wonderful exercise for us to go through in terms of the tool, but also in terms of the workshop. And I would highly recommend it to those of you who are considering something a similar exercise, especially given COVID-19 situation. Thank you.
Thanks Jason. I think I owe you a beer after that one. The reality is of these things is giving an organization permission to behave differently. That wasn't an opinion of a manager or somebody else, but is some data that helps have that conversation and communication. And I think what was amazing by your team was when they see those truths and then build a plan, often you get the excitement of the moment. To commit to long-term changing the mindsets of behavior is then from leadership. And as you said there, create the space and environment in which people can adapt. Rather than say, oh, why ain't adapting? Please adapt. Acknowledge and understand the different components. And I think this brings us on to how we as an organization at AQai have developed a model of adaptability and the science behind it and how it can have impacts. If we can do this in organizations like the UN, with all of the challenges of adaptability there, I think that's a great use case for any organizations facing different change. So what we started with and looked at were 3 core questions to answer in terms of who adapts and why, how and to what degree does someone adapt, and when. And so the model that we have, and we are quite geeky, in our world and frame. And so back to school of the periodic table, we have the adaptiotic table. And this is our ACE model of ability, character, and environment, addressing those 3 core questions. And then the sub-dimensions that sit inside each of those. And these words or even frameworks you might have danced with and flirted with in your organizations, but going deep into grit, for example, the passion and perseverance of a goal over the long term. Resilience, you talked about, Jason, the ability to fail and fail fast. If you're doing new things, the resilience to keep doing them when it doesn't go to expected needs to be built in. And a linked piece to that is the environmental team support. The workplace stress. How resilient do you need to be if you're under incredible stress to do things that are new and different? So all of these components have built our model, and I'm going to hand over to Nicolas a little bit more of how we really went deep to do something that isn't just a survey, not this is a nice, phrase. We've heard of EQ, now AQ in Singularity University. There's various little pockets of it, but to do it with absolute rigor where we can make a difference for people and organizations and in a really interesting way. So I'll hand you over to the doctor and he'll take us through where it's come from and some of the real deep thinking and science behind it. So go for it, Nicolas.
Thanks a lot, Ross. And if you have any questions, because sometimes I tend to be in my bubble, so just write a question. I'm happy to answer them a bit later. So actually, before I actually go into the science, I just want to give you a bit of a background of what the thinking was. So a bit over a year ago, Ross and Mike came to me and we were discussing, they had this idea, lots of research already about adaptability and how to measure it and assess it. And right from the start, they wanted to make sure that it really measures something we call adaptability and that actually has some impact for business. And when we started talking, I myself, who was working in HR as a VP for a big Swiss insurance company, I saw actually how it worked there, that we would have this big engagement survey once a year, everyone fills it out, and we have to give it to the board of directors, to the group. And this consulting company would give us then literally 80 pages of 50 different dimensions, and that was it. And what happened then, we had then in this company, this information overflow. It was like, okay, which of those dimensions actually matter? And on top of that, the dimensions were quite generic in the sense, okay, this is called engagement. What does it mean? Is everyone engaged or not engaged? So it somehow missed this uniqueness of the employee. And then let's say the presidents of the regions would then be, okay, honestly, I think we should focus on this. And then someone else said we should focus on leadership. And then in the end, it was a very big mess. And then actually no one ever looked at this science deck that was then created for lots of money, 80 pages, etc. So there was the mindset, okay, even though it has to be scientific, it has to be relevant for the business, and it cannot just be a detailed slide deck, a detailed assessment, a detailed survey that is too generic, that doesn't measure anything. It must be simple, it must be based on science, and it must be quantifiable. It cannot just be a feeling generic. So if we can go to the next slide, actually. Right from the start, therefore, we discussed in several calls, and Ross and Mike were very clear of that, it must be credible. It must be based on really the science. And we have this great, I think, luxury now. We have 20 years of research on psychology, behavior science, neuroscience, etc., that actually looked at how people adapt, how people change, how people motivate themselves. So the basic foundation was, okay, it's based on the best science and the real science. The second then is it must be representative. We didn't want to have let's say, an assessment that just works for a very small firm in some small country, etc. But it must represent all the different clients. And I'll talk about in a second when we made sure that it can do that. And it must be representative in the sense it's not a laboratory study. Even though it's scientific, it cannot just be a study based in a laboratory. So we then went to the studies, and you have so many studies, so we're very strict. It must be the best studies in the world by the best scientists. And we base the core of it on those studies, how they found, why are people adaptable, how are they adaptable. So 70%, most of their measures are based on studies before. And that's so important because we literally can pick the brains of the best scientists who looked at adaptability. However, we made sure adaptability in a business context, not adaptability just in some laboratory. And on top of that, we wanted to make sure they found some outcome. So they looked at adaptability, and somehow in their study, it improved, let's say, employee well-being. It improved performance, etc. So this big chunk of science was based on the studies that found adaptability to have an impact on outcome. Before we go to that slide quickly, another 30% was based on the discussions with HR leaders, because the field is just moving so fast, and we want to make sure, okay, we must make sure actually it's relevant for business right now. So Ross and Mike specifically had lots of discussions, interviews with business leaders, especially the HR community, I myself, and therefore we created 30% where we're like, okay, the field is moving so fast, per definition, adaptability, we must be adaptable. So let's adapt, create our own question. However, we use the basics of science, how to create questions for chatbot. Now, we had all those questions, and now I think comes the most coolest part, actually. So we have all those questions. They are all based on science. They should work, but let's make sure they work. So then we actually put it in the chatbot and let about 1,000 employees do it. And then comes the interesting thing, did it actually work? And luckily, we are all happy about that. It worked. So the first thing is the questions itself worked on a chatbot, because normally they are not on a chatbot. That means what we call is adaptability actually seems to be showing adaptable behavior. It's not something people just say, okay, I'm adaptable. No, it's actually behavior of adapting in a certain way. And it's valid. It means simply that it's not, let's say, engagement. It's adaptability, not something else. And now the final thing is the representativeness, I think, is it worked across settings. So what I saw when I worked in HR is people would be like, okay, you know what? This doesn't work for me. We are not the Google. This survey just works for them. Or we are this team of developers, etc. But we want to make sure, does it work across the teams? And we saw it does. We took out this effect of team size, of company, of some form, a bit also of personality. Be really sure this is the average effect of someone's adaptability. And then, most important thing is, we could predict if you improve adaptability by this much, engagement goes up, or employee well-being goes up. Or if you improve resilience, your adaptability is likely to go up on average across your team. So we could predict that. And I think that's the coolest part, because it's always you're adapting, seeing, and because we built this model with the different dimensions, as Roger said, they're stable, that we can take out some dimensions and be like, okay, maybe we have to adapt. We can plug something in, but it's stable. And then we can constantly refine. Yes, that's it from my side. If you have questions, just write in the chat. Might have been too fast. Yeah, thanks a lot.
I'm muted. That's great, Nicolas. Thank you. And just to come back to this, from our beta to this version, there were a couple of dimensions that we thought would work, but they didn't meet the reliability scores that we felt were good enough. They were 0.5 or 0.6 and not where we needed and wanted them to be. And so we did refine the model between the beta and this version here. I remember us going through that process once you start to build the data that's there. So what I'd like to do now is just to pick the pace up of, when you're building adaptable workforces, and this isn't about recruiting in highly adaptable people. It's about understanding and benchmarking your current workforce and organizational structure. And then being able to align communications, it was really important. Knowing whether somebody adapts because they need a burning platform or a burning ambition. Are they motivated, their motivation style about security, playing not to lose or playing to win? That can trigger different ways in which people comply or get excited and drive change. And really cultivating the resilient and experimental mindset is where you can go deep. So what I'm going to look to do now is see if I can share inside the actual platform. Mitesh, you mentioned that we had shared a link with a code for everyone who's on this webinar to be able to access their own AQai assessment, score, and profile. For those who've done it, you'll be familiar with this screen. For those who haven't, let's take you through it just for a couple of minutes. Essentially, you will get an overview of your score that's made up of all of those components of ability, character, and environment. And you can drill down then into each of the areas. So what is my ability across the different dimensions of grit, of mental flexibility, of mindset? Start to understand and see different insights. And what's really helpful and interesting that we've, of course, in all of these things, it's about development and upgrades of your roadmap. But one of the features that was really desired and looked for individuals was, how am I against the global average? Where am I benchmarked against? So with every assessment that's coming in, it's updating in real time. So you can see in this example here, my individual ability of 360 for this particular character. I can look at what's the current global average of that. So you can go through, that has been done for the ability and the environmental factors, and you can do it for each individual subdimension. So in terms of my level of grit, I can look at that against global average. I'm able to dive deeper into the different components of. And so great for an individual to start to understand what I see. The individual, there's a Chinese wall then for the company, that it's only when I get a team, I can then look at an aggregated team report. And I can look at this in a variety of different ways as an overall organization. And you start to then see the distribution across each of these dimensions. So when we start to go inside this, the difference between exploring and disrupting, between utilizing and improving different ways of applying adaptability for innovation, and we can then start to drill down in terms of filters. So I could look at, okay, just one particular team, what level. I can split it by age, by gender, and I can then relook and redo a report against those different things. Just interestingly, very quickly, I'm conscious of time because I want to get to some questions as well. Character, these are things where it is scales and range, not categorizations. We believe very strongly that all of this is improvable with intention and coaching, so that we can improve our mindsets for adaptability, we can improve the contexts for it. And this is a really great starting point for us and your organizations. I'm going to just hop back to the other deck from there. And I'd like to just grab another poll as a warm up to the, say, final sort of 5 or 7 minutes of questions. So Mitesh, could you, great, well done, thank you. How prepared for the future could your people, teams and workforce be if you developed their AQ? So if you put some focus and some effort to look at some support programs, understand, do a benchmark of currently where you are, put efforts behind it, how prepared could you be for uncertainty, for change, for future, whatever it throws? If you can just submit your thoughts there and Mitesh gather those. Let us know.
50% through, a couple
Great.
more. If we can get over 80%, just a few more there, get a good representation. Okay, there we go.
Well, that's the right answers, everyone. That's good. You know, nearly 80% highly and extremely, you know, what measures and gets reported on improves, you know, and we need to be improving the things that matter. And in an uncertain world, and one that is exponentially, you mentioned, Mitesh, change is a constant. What's different about change today is its speed and its acceleration. So what we've done, and what I'd like to do for everyone on this call, is if we've whet your appetite, if you want to go and discover your own, do that. You can go to the landing page here, aqai.io/SU50. You can get, with that same code that was done in the invite, which is SU50, do your own individual report for free. These are normally £50 for the assessments. And what we've also done in collaboration with Mitesh and the team at SU London is put together a team special package. So you can create team assessments, and as long as you have at least 5 individual AQMEs, you can then report on that as a team report. So what we're doing is offering a 50% discount code, so 10 assessments for the price of 5, and you'll be able to drill in and start to look at the actual distribution and dimensions and begin your first journey towards adaptability and intentional shift and change. On the landing page, you'll find a recording of this webinar as well, as soon as Zoom's done its work and we upload it. We'll also share on there a benchmark report of HR leaders. So this was across about 28 different countries and about 100 CHRO leaders and their index of their AQ in every different dimension, and some interesting parts, and also copy of this deck. And there's some additional slides that I won't go through, but if you go online, you'll get some more data and more information there. So I'm going to hand over to Mitesh to any questions and kind of filter those through for any of us to answer. I want to thank all of the fellow panelists and speakers, and hopefully you've learned something, been inspired to act, and look forward to supporting and answering any questions.
Thanks a lot for that, Ross, Nicolas, and Jason. We had a couple of questions coming into the chat, and I wonder whether I can raise some of them here, and they were answered in the chat, but I think it's worth actually chatting about them. So let's see here. Patrick asked the question, will there be a way for you to put results of team members from assessments, such as the Kolbe A index, which is one of the few instruments where a person's result doesn't change over time, as we know. So good question about, sort of taking other assessments and pulling them into the framework. Nicolas, you actually answered that. Maybe you could put some commentary behind that.
So on the culture thing, if we
on
took
the Kolbe,
on the Kolbe, yes.
Yeah.
So the Kolbe, we also took part. So what we also did, next to having our assessment, we also wanted to make sure that we capture personality assessments in general. So what we do is we captured, let's say, the big five. We captured other parts of personality assessments to see how different is actually this compared to our assessment. Is it maybe we measure the same or not? So we take care of that. And how it then can interlink, that's actually one thing we have to look forward to. Like, that's actually one of the cool things.
Yeah, if I just take that, that's one of our company ambitions, in the wider context of creating a new operating system for change. And that there are a number of assessments that, when combined together, can be really powerful insights. Kolbe, which looks at your cognitive across the 4 dimensions, of research, fact find, quick start, follow through, and these kinds of different areas of how we approach problem solving innately. There are some definite benefits and correlations. We're big fans of Kolbe. We use it ourselves, have done in a lot of previous business as well. So yeah, in answer to that question, we want to combine and look at the different correlations, different impacts, and eventually build this operating system for change that is a singular dashboard that starts to introduce multiple assessment data that people might have that can help augment around the user and around the teams, so that's part of our ambition and roadmap of collaborations.
So we're running out of time, but I just want to squeeze in rapid fire, final round. Cultural differences, how does it take into account cultural differences on adaptability? And then there was a question early on from Martin. Well, if we could take that one first.
Yeah,
sure.
Do you want to do that, Nicolas?
Sure, and I think that might cover a bit the culture question. So I think what Martin was asking, the predictive validity, and that, if I understand it correctly, is, do we actually predict something out of the adaptability? So we have different dimensions, and does it predict some behavior, some outcomes? We did that. I don't want to bore you too much, but we try to link all the dimensions to specific behaviors of adaptable behavior, basically, and see, is there a link? What we did then is we took care of the effect of the company, because some people could say, oh, actually, this is our company, the effect, and this team is so different. It doesn't really, it's not you who impacts it, but it's the individual. So we call that a multi-level model, that we make sure we take out this effect of the different levels, and it's really the effect of the person or us, the aggregated team, but it's not, let's say, the team culture, etc. Now, on the culture part, I think that answers a bit, because we control, it's not on the multi-level, but we control for countries, we control for gender and age. So we want to make sure this is really because of your individual, your individual difference, or let's say your environment, but not based on, let's say, gender, age, etc. However, one thing I think is very important here, we don't say there's one adaptable behavior. They're different. They're at least different behaviors. And obviously, there will be people that have different adaptable behaviors. They're unique. If it's now your culture or your upbringing or your personality, that's a different question. But we try to make sure that we capture those differences, but also take out, let's say, the noise of the country or other effects of just statistically from the company, etc. Yes, if you have any more questions, happy to answer them in detail. It took quite some time, and it's a bit.
And I think just looking at the time, we've finished our 45 minutes. It went really quickly, and we've gone a little bit over. So sorry for taking up some more of your time, but fantastic and very fascinating conversation, as you can tell. And you can see that this is just the start of something very enterprising, breaking new ground. And obviously, if you're interested in or a coach, you'd like to take this up further, you can see in the chat those ways for you to register and become a coach and learn more about where these assessments can take your organization and, of course, your business. So I just want to wrap up now and just thank the panel for joining and sharing and teaching us some new insights on where this industry is going. It looks fantastic, and please do get in touch with the team here. If you want more information, sign up, do the tests, play around with it, and really looking forward to seeing how this evolves over the coming year. Thanks, thanks everyone. Any closing remarks there, Ross, Nicolas, Jason?
Just wonderful. We're a collaborative bunch, so reach out to us if you want to get involved in any way, whether that's questions, contribution. Our mission is to make sure no one's left behind. We can't do that alone. We need to do it with lots of, mindset aligned people. So let's go and do it together. And if that has inspired you, then do reach out.